Yay! Happy Friday, everyone. So happy that you're here. Welcome to episode 4 of Founder Loveline. So as you might know, this event series is modeled off of Dr. Drew's radio show Loveline. So it's really your founder hotline, answering all of your burning questions, featuring tech leaders who have been in your shoes and really get it. So Ellie and I wanted to start this series to make space for humanizing entrepreneurship and creating a community of founders that can build side by side with proactive tools, frameworks, and share tactical knowledge. So we're so excited to have Nela joining us today. She's actually in Dubai at the moment. She's the co-founder of Ajla Consulting, and this is a unique communications consultancy that serves as a bridge closing the communication gap for startups. So with deep connections to stakeholders across the GCC, her consulting organization strategically is positioned to connect and influence the startups ecosystem. So thank you so much for being here, Nela. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, guys. I am a brand builder. I've been working in the GCC for the past 15 years, specifically in Dubai, with influence in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and the rest of the Gulf. And the industry I was working in before I went into this incredible world of startups was really very generic in general, but it gave me a lot of tools, especially in communication and brand building, and then living in this region in terms of having a huge network of companies, of investors, etc. So when we founded Ajla Consulting, it was actually to bridge the gap for founders in building this brand and this narrative from the ground up, and then connecting them with the right people, whether they want to grow their business or they want to find investors. So we connect to impact.
Amazing. So happy you're here and dropping some wisdom with us today. Allie's going to kick us off.
Awesome. So obviously, when you're talking about crafting your story as a founder, the first thing that comes to mind is fundraising. Having a very clear story and narrative as a founder is more important than just for fundraising. But I do think that it kind of starts with that. And you've been so deep in this working with global founders. Just as a high level, how can startups understand the pitch process and start to, build from their idea, crafting their vision and starting to craft their story?
Yeah, I love this question because storytelling is just one small element of what I like to call brand building. So as soon as a founder has an idea, they have to start building their brand immediately. And that starts from a personal branding perspective. So you want to start crafting that narrative about yourself as a founder to build as much of a network as you can, even before that idea becomes a product, because we all know at the idea phase, we're going to friends and family, we're telling them our idea, we're getting some investment, we're getting started like that, we're looking for grants, and then we're going to the angels, the business angels, the angel investors, and this all happens at pre-seed level. And pre-seed is probably the most important time for you as a founder, because that's when you really start to craft your story. Where the storytelling comes in is, first, let me just break it down. First, you need to have a vision for not just your product, but for the world and how your product will impact the world. And it needs to be a really big vision. And once you have that vision, you want to extract the key messages out of it and then highlight who your audience is. And this is a very structured way to do this. And it's really good for the founders who aren't as charismatic, as outgoing. They need to have some structure. So once you have that vision, you can really start to build your narrative. And your narrative should ideally be 3 minutes long. So that's around 500, 600 words, depending on how fast you speak. And in that 3 minutes, you should be able to tell anyone what you're building and what you're growing. The reason I say this is that everyone everyone, a lot of founders that I've met really rely on their deck when they're meeting with investors. But you don't just meet investors in boardrooms. You meet investors at events, you meet them in coffee shops. If the networking effects take place, you meet them through connections. So you really need to be able to highlight why they should speak to you or why they should go to the next phase with you or have you pitch to them. And that's why building this 3-minute story is really important. Investors need to believe in that big picture, in the possibility of the big picture you want to tell them. Because a lot of founders think that their product is super, is the most important part of their brand, their product and the problem they're solving. But when you speak to founders, especially if you're going to somewhere like Saudi Arabia, which has a completely different investment thesis to investors in the States, if you're going to investors, then they want to be part of the big picture. And if you manage to convince the investor that what you're trying to build is possible, so you don't need to convince them in your idea, but if you convince them in your vision that there is a possibility that you can get there, like what if I'm right? They will see you as the outlier. They will potentially see you as the fund returner. And that will change their mindset. And Robbie Crabtree speaks about this. It will change their mindset where they will start to look at the upside case for your startup as opposed to focusing on the downside risk. So before you get into the product, before you get into the numbers, before you get into anything else, you have to convince them of the big picture and then narrow it down into how your product is going to do that, and then go to the numbers and ask them to throw fuel on this fire that you've started so that we can really blow this product up.
Yeah, I love that you kind of even start from the personal brand side of a founder, because it's all about that big picture. Reading this book called Known by Mark Schaefer, and it's about building your brand as a person outside of, maybe if you were all at all of these tech companies, Google, Facebook, and then you leave and you lose that sense of how do people identify me? How do people know me? And building your brand outside of that, maybe as a thought leader or, as you're starting your new company and having people know you for your expertise or your vision really can help you in that process. So I love that you kind of framed it from even before you're thinking about yourself as your story as the product. It's, why you as a founder, and also framing it of having this structure if you're not the most charismatic founder, because not every founder is going to be the most charismatic person in the world, and you don't have to be. You just have to have that structure. So I think that's super important to touch on, because I think a lot of founders struggle with that piece of, how can I really bring this charisma? But it's really about preparation.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, a lot of founders feel that investors are only interested in, like I said, in the numbers. But there's a lot you can learn about a founder and a founder's potential from their personal story. And many founders shy away from that person. And it doesn't even have to be related to the business. If you're telling a personal story of being in a band or doing a kind of sport, it can really shape you as an individual and showcase or demonstrate your potential for success to investors. And I think when you get that idea of focusing on that personal narrative and that personal brand is highly, highly important.
Yeah, I so resonate with this, and I want to emphasize the whole humanizing approach of entrepreneurship. It's the individual. And Ali, I'm going to have to pick up that book, because that's what it's about, is like ideas come and go, businesses come and go. The investor is investing in you as an individual. And sometimes it's hard to get out of our own way in how we tell our story. But one of the very first things on the ladder of proof is founder conviction. And to articulate that in a way to an investor, for them to view you as the leader who can go out and solve that problem and have the capital efficiency with the funds that they're going to be giving you is a huge aspect of it. So I know this is a common pitfall for a lot of founders of finding that balance between, my personal narrative and then my vision for the company. I'm just curious if there's any tips that you would give to founders telling that story and how they can get out of their own way and be able to articulate it in a way that they can be seen.
That comes from practice. So the worst thing you can say as a founder is, I'm just going to wing it. There is no winging it. So it comes from structure and practice. And even the most charismatic founder, you will find, will sit and structure how they will communicate their brand and how they will communicate themselves. And very experienced founders, and I'm saying not first-time founders, but very experienced founders, will even look at each investor individually and who they're pitching to within, if they're pitching to a VC, within their VC, to see if they can find some common ground or some commonality that they can come in with. So if you're pitching to a VC and to specifically a person who was on their college football team, you might come in with a story where you guys will create a personal bond first before going into the bigger picture, into speaking about your brand and your product. And secondly is that there's two types of founders generally. Ones that are that will tend to agree with everything the investor says and are really looking for investor validation, and others who are extremely confident, maybe sometimes overconfident, and really, believe that their idea is the one, and they really want to push that. So they're very aggressive. And what founders need to focus on is they need to identify what kind they are. So self-identification is really important here. And then sort of find that Goldilocks zone where it's in between the very passive and very aggressive kind of founder, because neither really works. And that's why a lot of pitches don't work, because if you find a VC with a great investment thesis, they have the dry powder, and you don't want them to perceive you as a risk. So the aggressive founder will be perceived as a risk because they will not listen and cannot be controlled from a perception standpoint. And the passive founder will be perceived as a follower, as someone who will just listen to what the investor advises. But founders have to remember that they are the expert on their business. There is no one in the world more better positioned to grow their business and to understand their vision and to understand their brand and their product and where they want to go than themselves. Investors have a huge portfolio of companies. They see tens to hundreds of pitch decks, on a monthly basis. So it's about finding that middle ground where the investor sees you as, like I said, the outlier, the right person to move this business return.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that. I'm curious if there's like a shareable piece or a framework that you would recommend to founders kind of walking through that process of how they can draw some of those, it's like the anatomy of that story, right? How can you tap into that? Do you have any feedback on that front?
Yes, when you're structuring, start with a one-pager. Start it with a one-pager and get everything down in those 500 words. And that will help you shape the way that your pitch deck is structured and the way that you tell your story. With no founder is the same, not a single one, and no pitch deck is the same. So my biggest advice is for founders not to look at generic advice and generic pitch decks and, what worked for someone will not work for them. They really have to dig deep and have a deep understanding of where they want to go. That's why I always narrow in on the vision. And sometimes they don't even recognize the potential of their product. And that's why it's really good to speak to someone like a narrative builder to sort of lay everything out on the table, where we can then go and pick up on what will really sell to the investor and help you structure your vision and open your mind up, because there's a lot of scarcity mentality that happens. There's a lot of imposter syndrome that happens with founders, and we really help break that down for them. So if you're working on your own story, you sit down, you write your one pager, and then you see, how can I push this further? How can I push this into the future? How will I change the world with my brand or with my product? And then you narrow it down. And that's always my advice. The 3 minutes, the 3-minute pitch is very tactical, but you need to have good tactics along with your strategy, and not relying on your deck. So you should be able to tell an investor in your 15-minute pitch the entire story without the deck. You should even be able to send them the deck in advance and have them ask you questions and answer all of their questions and anticipate all of their questions. So don't rely on the deck to pitch your investor. And finally, when you have a success with an investor, when you get that first investment, you also have to understand that you will evolve. So you can't rely on your old story. You can't rely on your old narrative. You will evolve. Even your vision generally stays static. But because we cannot predict the future, no one predicted COVID, right? And a lot of people had to pivot and had to change their company vision, their offering, and many succeeded. And it was being agile enough to change that. So don't stick to that one narrative just because it worked this time. Because remember, as you grow from pre-seed and you hit your milestones and you get to seed and you hit your milestones and you get to Series A, investors are also looking for different things. At pre-seed, the founder is the biggest value proposition of any brand. And I know with the business angels, like for us as angel investors, we're not experienced investors, but we're crazy risk takers a lot of the time. But it's that, that instinctual feeling that you have with the founder that they can execute, because anyone can have an idea. It's to show that you can execute this idea. And to not be afraid of failure, because everything is a learning. And finally, where a lot of founders that I've worked with fail is they tend to like to talk a lot and not listen. And you can have a lot more value by listening and picking up on things and picking up on cues. It's very difficult now because we're pitching a lot over Zoom. We're pitching less and less in person, but learn how to pick up on certain visual cues where what you're pitching is not gelling with an investor. So if you're not cohesive, or if you're not giving the investor what they're looking for, you've either lost them and it's a lost cause, or you can bring them back, and you should be able to tell that with the visual cues and also with what they're saying.
Yeah, it's super helpful. Don't get too attached to the narrative, to the pitch. It's evolving. You're evolving as an individual. So yeah, I think it's really important to stay fluid in the entire process.
No, absolutely. And to know how to identify any opportunities, to pivot your narrative and to tell a different kind of story. But around that story, you also need to be building the brand. Because remember, investors are just people. They're very dynamic. So they're on the LinkedIn, they're reading the newspapers, they're listening to podcasts. And where a lot of founders, and it's not that they go wrong, it's just that, investment is an issue. So when they get that investment, they want to put the majority of it on either, depending on how much tech they require or how much development they require, either on building the tech or on growth. And growth is your inbound, your outbound marketing, but they don't focus on brand building. And if we look at any IPO'd brand, like an Apple, an Amazon, if you look in their financial statements, you'll see that they have something called brand value. So if the business value is at 800 million or $800 billion, for Amazon, for example, almost half of their value is in their brand. For Apple, a third of their value is actually in their brand. And resilient brands survive the storm a lot better than brands who do not invest in that brand building. And that's something I also advise, my founders, when you get your first investment, always invest like 5%, 4% at the beginning, especially into brand. I would advise them to invest 30-40%, but they're not there yet. And if we look at, and why I say brand is important, when something happens, something negative happens in the press, your brand value falls, your stock price falls. It happens immediately. It's a 24-hour process, and strong brands survive. They bring their stock price up. They bring their brand value up. A lot of the weaker brands who haven't invested will take a lot longer to bring their reputation back up, to bring stakeholder trust back up. So storytelling is one element, but brand building is actually the bigger element that founders should focus on.
And when you think about brand building, when you say, allocating dollars towards that, in my mind, it goes to, thought leadership. It goes to your social media presence. It goes to different webinars that you can host. Again, really resonating. Is that what comes to mind? Or are there other components that you recommend?
That is what comes to mind, but that's very personal. And what we tend to do is we tend to stay in our echo chambers. So once you join a community, you just tend to stay in that community. And if you build a big presence on LinkedIn, it's usually a presence, if you're a founder, of fellow founders and investors. So I always recommend to actually do some PR. That means go out of your circle into the mainstream as much as you can, because that's where you'll have an impact. So interviews, thought leadership, but with a magazine or an online publication or a platform that might not be in the founder investor realm or in the tech realm. If you're a tech founder, that can go to lifestyle, that can speak about the benefit of your product more than the product itself, or anything like that. It's just to get out of that echo chamber. And obviously LinkedIn, for example, as a platform, I think is fantastic for thought leadership. And it's difficult. It's difficult to sit and post every day or 4 or 5 times a week. It's difficult to engage. Sometimes you don't feel like it, but you have to have that mindset of doing it for the bigger picture. And it's also okay to take a break from it, but there should be a consistency. So even if you're taking a break, it's not a long break, and then you come back with consistency. And again, so let me speak about the GCC specifically and GCC investors. If you're not featured in the Bloomberg, for example, they might not take you as seriously. If you're not featured in a Gulf News or a CEO Middle East, even a small part, because they'll Google you. And if the only reinforcement they get of your expertise is what you're saying about yourself, if there's no credentialing behind you, it's sometimes not enough. And this is especially true for the Saudi market, because Saudi market wants to just take over the world. And they're investing everywhere. So geography is not an issue. And what they want is they want big visions that align with their big vision. They act very fast and they can put a lot of fuel on any brand's fire and really light it up on a global scale. I think it's different in the US. It's a much more mature investor market. It's much more risk averse. There is still a lot of dry powder for a lot of industries, but I think the way that investors are investing has changed a lot, and what they're looking for from founders has changed a lot. And it's really stressful for a founder. So sometimes, why I do what I do is because I want to ease that path for the founder. It's like it's a huge passion of mine. And then, when I focus on Serbia, on the market that I work with a lot, it's also about growing the brand of the country and growing the brand of the industry, of STEM, seeing more women. I mean, we've got 5 women investors in our angel investor group, just 5. So, you explore why that is that way. And it's also because and this is a global thing, I'm sure that it's the same there in the States, that there's not enough stories being told about women who are leading, or diverse populations who are leading, so that we can even out the playing field. Diversity is really important. And I would recommend any founder starting a business also at the idea stage to see how they can inject diversity from the offset, because there's studies that have found that diverse companies actually perform better. And that is having a diverse leadership at the top making key decisions. It's not whitewashing it with diversity at the lower rungs, or just having someone placed there, but actually having it be part of their story and part of their narrative and part of their vision from the very idea phase.
Wouldn't that be a beautiful sight? Such opportunities to build things right from the beginning. Resonates with many of us.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. No, I just kind of wanted to double tap on some of the things that you're saying about, your experience with, founders in the GCC, and then, the difference between investors in the United States regions versus the GCC, and how founders can adequately prepare to understand their audience. Because when you're pitching in different regions, they're going to be looking for different things. They're going to be different cultural norms. And I think from a high level, you can easily say, well, just understand your audience. But how do they do that? How does a founder really understand where they're pitching and who they're pitching, and kind of get some more detail on how they can present their story?
Understanding your audience is, you're right, it's very high level. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of now we're pitching this region and we're pitching this region. It's like when you're playing chess, you always have to have your own back, and you always have to focus on your own game. So your story does not necessarily have to resonate with that one person that you're pitching to, unless you're finding something very personal that you can connect on, like I said before. But your story has to resonate with the wider vision of the region that you're going to. Because when you're going into a certain region, especially here in the GCC, they're all aligned with the vision of the country and the direction of the country, because the countries are so young in their growth phases. So it's a big push, and that's how they get stakeholder support on a wider scale. So there's a lot of ultra high net worth individuals here. There's a lot of family offices here. There's quite a few VCs, and then there's the public investment funds, and they're all highly accessible. So I'm going to bring it back to the vision. It's not having to drill down and change the narrative for each region, but it's really being so strong on your vision, and then how you can link that vision to the vision of the region that you're going to, or to the vision of, or the thesis of the investment fund that you're going to. That's probably the most important thing. And I want to really frame it out for you, because it's a simple 3-step process. It is to understand your vision. It is to have your key messages ready. And that is very important, to know your key messages, because it will help you build your narrative. And it is to know your audiences, and on a broad spectrum. So if your stakeholders are investors, the media, founders within your spectrum, you know, and whoever else your other stakeholders might be. They could be government stakeholders, they could be your clients, they could be your potential partners, they could be existing partners. Once you outline that key audience and your key messages, then you build your narrative, and you focus vision, then product. And a lot of, you know, and I guess the most classic example of telling your story is to focus on the problem and the solution, right? That's what a lot of founders do. So they identify the problem, then they identify the solution. Some problems are very complex, so you have to take time to explain the problem and then how you're solving it. But some problems are not as complex, so you wouldn't want to focus on that, right? So it's to take your vision, to take the problem, if we want to put it that way, the solution, and the most important thing is, this is the vision, and what if I'm right?
I love that. That's a great way to wrap everything up. And the framework is really helpful for all founders, especially the early stage and founders who haven't fundraised before. So I think this is so helpful, just to frame it out in those steps and help founders really understand how they can craft that vision and be successful.
No, absolutely. And the last thing I want to say is, founders, talk to each other, use your community, use your network, tell them your ideas, send them your 500 words, let people have an input, but know that you're the owner of it. So whatever feedback you get, you can choose to listen to it or not listen to it. You know, I love the phrase, the Goldilocks zone. Find that comfortable zone that's good for you, because when you're comfortable, and when you know what you want to say and you know how you want to say it, you will appear confident. If you don't have that confidence, if you don't have that charisma, if you're very charismatic, very loud, it will rein you in. So it's really good to get feedback all the time.
I love that. That's great. And yeah, I think it's important to note exactly what you said. You know, feedback is feedback. And if at the end of the day, doesn't resonate with the message that you're going to have conviction with, you know, it might not be the best feedback, but always giving feedback is super important.
I love this topic. Thank you so much, Nela. Critical part of the journey, storytelling, crafting your narrative. So thank you so much for sharing the tips and the do's and don'ts, and some practical frameworks that we can use as we're all evolving as individuals. So thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you on the next one, which is December 15th. We'll have Tim Wenzel on. He's the first recruiter at PayPal. So looking forward to a discussion around hiring. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
How did that go?
That was great.
Yeah, it's great.
I loved that. That was very tactical. I feel like there's tons of stuff we can pull out from that. So
yeah, I'm picturing the magic links that will come out of this once we process it.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you summarized it. I like how you did that at the end of like 1, 2, 3. I think that's going to be a really powerful piece right there. But no, I thought it was great.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, and have a great day.
Thank you. Enjoy
have a great
weekend.
I'm going drinking now.
Yeah, enjoy. Take care.
Bye.